Imagine the one person who swore they would never admit they were wrong, suddenly apologizing to you. Not out of guilt, out of necessity, out of the realization that losing you would cost them more than their pride. Most people think a narcissist will never apologize, but the truth is, there are 7 specific actions that flip their entire psychological system. Do them right, and they'll come back with words you never thought you'd hear. I'm sorry, I messed up. If you want me to break down each of these 7 actions in detail and explain exactly how to apply them in real life situations, drop a comment saying, "Explain the 7," and I'll create a full breakdown for you. The first action is to go completely calm. And this type of calm is not emotional shutdown, not passive aggression, and not the kind of silence that tries to punish someone. This is a different level of calm, one that signals you have stepped out of the emotional arena entirely. Narcissists operate through emotional exchange. They pull energy from reactions, intensity, confusion, and the emotional turbulence they create. When you go calm, you break the cycle that keeps them in control. They expect anger, tears, long explanations, or attempts to fix the situation. What they do not expect is emotional stillness. This stillness communicates one thing clearly: you have stopped playing their game. Your calm is not silence that seeks attention. It is not a tactic to make them chase you. It is simply you refusing to give emotional power to the situation. Narcissists depend on emotional escalation because escalation keeps you invested. They know that if you are upset, you care. If you argue, they still have influence. If they can make you overthink, they still have a place in your mental world. Calm removes all those indicators. When you speak with a neutral tone, short sentences, and absolutely no emotional charge, they realize something is different, something they can't immediately control. This calm shifts the psychological dynamic because now you are not feeding their ego. You are not rewarding their behavior with emotional currency. When a narcissist loses that immediate feedback loop, their internal system starts malfunctioning. They expect you to react, and when you don't, they begin questioning what changed. They wonder if someone else has your attention, if you are losing attachment to them, or if they miscalculated their power. This internal spiral is what eventually pushes them toward an apology. They need to restore the previous balance where your emotions fueled their sense of dominance. Without your emotional energy, they feel weaker, less in control, and more uncertain. Remaining calm also places responsibility back on them. When you remove emotional noise, their behavior becomes obvious. They can't twist the narrative or blame you for overreacting. They can't call you dramatic or accuse you of misunderstanding. Your calm invalidates every excuse they normally rely on. For the first time, they are left alone with their behavior without your reactions to distract them. That psychological discomfort forces a moment of introspection, not because they suddenly developed empathy, but because their usual strategies stop working. This calm also shows them that you are no longer influenced by their manipulation. That scares them more than anything. When they cannot trigger you, they cannot control you. When they cannot control you, they fear losing you. And their fear of losing access to your attention, support, validation, or presence becomes the driving force behind their apology. It is not guilt, it is self-preservation. Your calm communicates that their behavior no longer has power over you. And once they feel that loss of influence, apologizing becomes the quickest path to regaining it. The second action is to remove their favorite energy source, which is your reactions. Narcissists thrive on the emotional feedback you give them, whether it's anger, frustration, desperation, or even excitement. Every reaction you have is like fuel for their engine. It powers their sense of superiority, reinforces their control, and validates their behavior. When you stop reacting, when you respond with neutrality or minimal engagement, you are effectively cutting off that fuel. This is not about ignoring them or pretending they don't exist. It's about consciously refusing to give them emotional electricity that feeds their ego and manipulations. When you stop feeding their need for attention and validation, it creates a void that they are not used to facing, and this void forces a kind of internal reckoning. Narcissists are calibrated to respond to emotional cues. They are constantly scanning for signals of vulnerability, excitement, or frustration. Even subtle reactions, eye rolls, sighs, hesitations, or overthinking can be interpreted as signs of engagement. When they no longer see those cues, the system they rely on to control and predict others' behavior begins to destabilize. They experience confusion, frustration, and even anxiety because their usual methods of influence are failing. Without your reactions, they can't manipulate the situation to make themselves feel dominant or validated, and that loss of influence can be deeply unsettling for them. Maintaining this neutrality requires absolute consistency. Even small lapses, a sarcastic comment, a sharp retort, or an emotional expression give them back a fraction of the energy they crave, and they will immediately notice it. They may test boundaries, escalate provocations, or attempt to draw you back into emotional engagement. This is where most people fail. They respond just enough to keep the cycle alive. But if you stay neutral and refuse to feed into the game, the narcissist is forced to confront a new reality. The strategies they once relied on no longer work, and they begin to reassess the dynamics of the relationship. This recalibration often leads them to consider an apology because it becomes a practical step to restore influence or regain access to what they've lost. This strategy is also powerful because it removes any excuse for the narcissist to project blame onto you. Without reactions to manipulate or twist, they are left facing their actions without distractions. It creates a situation where they must acknowledge that your withdrawal of engagement is a direct consequence of their behavior. They start seeing the connection between their actions and the absence of the reaction they once depended on, and that realization is what triggers accountability. Over time, the lack of emotional supply you provide acts as a mirror, reflecting their behavior back to them, destabilizing the manipulative loop and nudging them toward an apology, not out of guilt or empathy, but out of necessity and self-interest, because they cannot regain their sense of control or access to you without it. The third action is to set clear boundaries, and this is where most people underestimate the power of structure. Narcissists rely on ambiguity, loopholes, and shifting expectations to maintain control over you. When you establish firm, non-negotiable boundaries, you are creating a framework they cannot manipulate. This is not about making threats, arguing, or trying to shame them into compliance. It's about clearly defining what is acceptable and what is not, and then living those boundaries consistently. For example, you might decide that disrespectful language, gaslighting, or constant criticism will no longer be tolerated. You communicate this calmly and confidently, and then you enforce it without wavering. Narcissists are not used to people maintaining that level of consistency because they thrive on emotional inconsistency and the uncertainty it generates. When you enforce a boundary, it immediately disrupts their control loop. They are forced to recognize that certain behaviors no longer yield results. Their usual tactics, blame shifting, guilt tripping, or manipulative charm, fail to break through because you have created a clear line they cannot cross. Boundaries signal power. They communicate that you have control over your own life, your choices, and your emotional space. Narcissists instinctively resist losing control, and when they realize that you are no longer pliable, a subtle internal panic can set in. This is the moment where the possibility of an apology begins to take shape because they now see that continuing their behavior has tangible consequences. They lose access to your time, energy, or attention. The key to making boundaries effective is not in the declaration alone, but in consistent enforcement. If a narcissist crosses a boundary and you react with anger or try to negotiate, the message becomes diluted. Boundaries only work when they are absolute, unwavering, and applied without justification or debate. The clarity and predictability of your boundaries create a scenario where the narcissist is forced to reconsider their behavior. They cannot manipulate you into bending the rules because the rules exist outside their control, and that realization is uncomfortable. Over time, as they encounter repeated evidence that their usual tactics are ineffective, they begin to recognize that their actions are causing real consequences, and the path of least resistance often becomes an apology. It's also important to understand that boundaries are a form of self-respect, not punishment. They communicate that your peace, dignity, and emotional safety are non-negotiable. Narcissists are drawn to those who allow manipulation because it reinforces their sense of superiority. When you set boundaries, you demonstrate that their usual leverage is useless, and this threatens to key narrative they have built about themselves and the world. In response to that threat, a narcissist may apologize, not necessarily because they feel genuine remorse, but because the apology becomes a strategic move to regain access, rebuild control, or stabilize the connection you've now made conditional on respect. By creating a framework that cannot be violated, you shift the power dynamic entirely. And in that shift lies the potential for the apology you've been waiting for. The fourth action is to invest heavily in yourself, and this goes far beyond superficial self-improvement. Narcissists are drawn to control and manipulation in part because they perceive others as dependent, malleable, or lacking independence. When you focus on your own growth, your goals, your physical and mental health, your skills, and your emotional well-being, you create a space that is untouchable. This is not about proving anything to them or showing off. It's about building a version of yourself that no longer relies on their validation. The more you level up in areas that matter to you, the more you signal autonomy, strength, and self-sufficiency. Narcissists fear this because it erodes the foundation of their influence. Self-investment is powerful because it disrupts their control narrative. They thrive on dependency. They need to believe that you cannot thrive without their attention, approval, or presence. When they see you becoming more competent, more confident, and more fulfilled independently, they recognize that their usual tactics no longer hold the same weight. This triggers insecurity because their sense of superiority is tied to the ability to manipulate or dominate others. Every step you take towards self-mastery sends a signal. You are no longer operating under their rules, and your life does not revolve around their whims. This is a subtle but profound shift that makes them reevaluate their behavior, sometimes culminating in an apology as they attempt to regain influence. The beauty of self-investment is that it is undeniable. You don't have to argue or explain your changes. The results are visible in your demeanor, your accomplishments, and your confidence. Narcissists are naturally observant. They notice growth, changes in routine, and an elevated sense of self. Unlike emotional appeals or arguments, your self improvement cannot be manipulated, twisted, or minimized. It is a neutral, fact based reflection of your independence, and that threatens their ego more than confrontation ever could. In many cases, their apology is less about remorse and more about strategy. They recognize that by acknowledging your worth, they might maintain some connection or mitigate loss. Consistency in self investment is critical. A single moment of progress is insufficient. The narcissist needs to experience the pattern over time. They must see that your independence is not temporary or reactive, but a permanent recalibration of your priorities and values. This sustained demonstration of self sufficiency makes it difficult for them to continue exploiting old behaviors. They may attempt to charm, manipulate, or provoke you, but your continued focus on growth reduces their leverage. The combination of visible autonomy and emotional detachment compels them to confront the consequences of their behavior. Ultimately, investing in yourself creates a scenario where an apology becomes a logical response for the narcissist. They see that their past actions caused real consequences. You are thriving, your emotional energy is no longer accessible on demand, and their control has weakened. The apology is a tactical move to regain proximity or influence, but it also reflects the undeniable truth. They underestimated your independence and the power of self investment. By prioritizing your growth and refusing to let their behavior derail it, you not only reclaim control over your life, but also catalyze the conditions that make an apology possible. The fifth action is to withdraw privileges they have taken for granted. And this is often one of the most overlooked yet effective strategies when dealing with a narcissist. Privileges are not just material things. They are your time, attention, energy, emotional labor, and availability. Narcissists operate under the assumption that these resources are always accessible to them, and they exploit this assumption to maintain control and feed their ego. When you consciously remove these privileges, you create a vacuum they are unprepared for. This is not about punishing them or seeking revenge. It is about reclaiming your own autonomy and signaling that their behavior has tangible consequences. The moment you stop providing what they expect automatically, you disrupt their control framework. Withdrawing privileges works because narcissists are trained to take, not give. They assume your presence, your responses, your effort, and even your forgiveness are always available. When you remove these predictable sources of supply, they experience a type of psychological friction they are not used to. They may attempt to bargain, charm, or provoke you to regain access, but if you remain firm, you are demonstrating that their previous behavior directly led to a loss of influence. This withdrawal creates tension and forces them to confront the fact that their actions have consequences beyond their immediate control. Unlike arguments or attempts to reason with them, this approach works because it leverages the scarcity principle. When something they rely on becomes limited, its value skyrockets in their perception, and they begin to take notice in a way that can ultimately trigger an apology. Consistency is critical in this strategy. You cannot remove privileges intermittently or partially because the narcissist will detect the loopholes and exploit them. If your withdrawal is inconsistent, they interpret it as a temporary or emotional reaction, which fails to communicate the seriousness of the boundary. But when your absence of supply becomes steady and predictable, it forces a recalibration. They start measuring the consequences of their behavior against the access they are losing, and this comparison creates a psychological nudge toward reconciliation. Essentially, by withholding what they take for granted, you create conditions where apologizing is the most logical option for them to regain lost influence. Withdrawing privileges also works because it eliminates opportunities for manipulation. When you stop giving them immediate access to your attention, your responses, or your emotional engagement, they no longer have material to twist or exploit. They are left facing the reality of their actions without distractions, and this exposure is uncomfortable for them. They begin to realize that previous patterns, harsh words, gaslighting, or emotional abuse cannot continue without jeopardizing the connection entirely. This moment of clarity is when they are most likely to apologize, not out of genuine remorse, but because it becomes a tactical necessity to restore access to the privileges they have lost. Ultimately, withdrawing privileges is about reclaiming control and shifting the power dynamic. It forces the narcissist to recognize the cost of their behavior in a concrete, undeniable way. Your consistency, self-possession, and refusal to provide automatic supply create pressure they cannot ignore. That pressure, combined with their need to regain access, sets the stage for an apology, making it one of the most effective tools for creating accountability without engaging in endless confrontation or emotional manipulation. The sixth action is to stay consistent, and this is the critical factor that separates temporary gains from lasting change when dealing with a narcissist. Consistency is not about rigid rules for their sake. It's about creating a predictable framework that your behavior adheres to, regardless of their provocations, manipulations, or attempts to destabilize you. Narcissists thrive on inconsistency because it keeps you off balance, reactive, and easier to control. The moment your responses, boundaries, and actions become consistent, it disrupts the cycle they rely on and forces them to reassess the situation. They begin to realize that their usual strategies, gaslighting, guilt tripping, charm offensives, no longer have the desired effect, and that realization is what eventually nudges them toward apology. Consistency is effective because narcissists are trained to exploit emotional and behavioral fluctuations. If you react one day and withdraw the next, if your boundaries are firm sometimes and flexible at others, they perceive it as a continuation of the game. Every small lapse gives them energy and maintains their sense of control. On the other hand, when your behavior is unwavering, they start to notice the pattern. Your calm, your neutrality, your refusal to provide emotional supply, and your enforcement of boundaries all combine to form a consistent signal. You are no longer operating under their rules. Over time, this creates cognitive friction for them because they are forced to acknowledge a reality they cannot manipulate. They cannot predict your reactions or bend you to their will, and that unpredictability for them is uncomfortable and threatening. Consistency also reinforces the lessons taught by your other actions. When you go calm, remove reactions, set boundaries, invest in yourself, and withdraw privileges, all of those actions are amplified when repeated reliably. The narcissist cannot chalk your behavior up to a temporary mood, a momentary strength, or luck. They see it as a permanent shift, and that permanence forces accountability. They begin to connect their previous actions to the consequences they are experiencing, the loss of attention, influence, or emotional supply, and the weight of that connection often leads to a strategic apology. This apology is not born from sudden empathy, but from recognition that the cost of continuing the same behavior is too high. Consistency also prevents manipulation loops from restarting. Narcissists are highly observant and will probe, test, and escalate whenever they sense vulnerability or inconsistency. Each test is designed to see if old patterns can return. If you respond inconsistently, the cycle resets. But if you remain steady, firm, and predictable in your actions and boundaries, they cannot reset the cycle. They face the reality that your behavior is no longer a moving target and their previous manipulations are ineffective. This relentless, unwavering approach creates psychological pressure that often culminates in them issuing an apology as a means of stabilizing the connection or regaining access to what they have lost. In short, staying consistent is not just a strategy, it is the backbone of all other actions. It turns temporary disruption into permanent change, reinforces your boundaries and autonomy, and creates the conditions under which a narcissist feels compelled to acknowledge their mistakes. Without consistency, every other action loses power. But with it, you create an environment where an apology is not only possible, but inevitable. The seventh action is to give them nothing to attack, and this is one of the most subtle yet powerful strategies when dealing with a narcissist. Narcissists feed on conflict, blame, and the projection of your emotions because it validates their sense of superiority and control. Every opportunity they perceive to manipulate, criticize, or provoke you is a chance to maintain power. By removing those opportunities, by refusing to present vulnerabilities or emotional reactions they can exploit, you destabilize their usual patterns. You become a mirror that reflects only truth and calm, leaving them without material to distort or twist. This is not about hiding your feelings or suppressing your identity. It's about strategic composure and deliberate self-control that deprives them of leverage. Giving them nothing to attack works because narcissists operate in a reactive ecosystem. They thrive when others respond emotionally to their provocations. If you remain neutral, steady, and aligned with your own principles, they cannot generate the drama they rely on. Every word, reaction, or gesture you withhold as an emotional trigger becomes a barrier to their usual manipulation. They are forced to confront the reality of their actions without distraction. They cannot deflect blame, gaslight, or provoke guilt because you have removed the hooks they typically use to manipulate you. This removal of leverage creates a psychological imbalance that is uncomfortable for them and forces introspection, an introspection that often lays the groundwork for an apology. Consistency in this approach is critical. A single moment of vulnerability, an impulsive reaction, or a defensive outburst can give them just enough material to regain momentum. Narcissists are incredibly perceptive and will exploit even the smallest crack in your armor. But when you maintain composure across every interaction, you create an environment where their usual tactics fail repeatedly. Over time, the repeated inability to provoke you highlights the ineffectiveness of their manipulations, and they are compelled to reassess the dynamics of the relationship. The lack of attacks or emotional triggers forces them to realize that their actions have consequences, and that realization is what drives the necessity for an apology. This strategy also communicates one crucial truth. You are in control of your own emotional state. Narcissists are threatened by the realization that they cannot dictate your feelings or reactions. By giving them nothing to attack, you assert autonomy and remove the illusion of their power. They begin to recognize that to regain access to your attention, cooperation, or presence, they must acknowledge their wrongdoing. The apology in this context becomes a calculated response to the disruption of their control rather than a sudden moral awakening. It is their way of restoring balance and access in a situation where your steady, unyielding presence has limited their influence. Ultimately, giving a narcissist nothing to attack is about strategic detachment and unwavering composure. It deprives them of the tools they need to manipulate you, exposes the consequences of their behavior, and forces them to confront the reality of their actions. In doing so, it creates the conditions under which an apology becomes the most logical step for them, not out of genuine remorse necessarily, but out of the need to reestablish influence, regain stability, and restore access to what they can no longer take for granted. The eighth action is to create conditions where you don't demand an apology, but make it necessary for them to offer one. And this is the culmination of all the previous steps. Narcissists are rarely moved by moral reasoning, guilt, or emotional appeals. Trying to force them to apologize usually backfires because they perceive it as a challenge to their control and respond with defensiveness, denial, or further manipulation. The goal is not to extract an apology through confrontation, but to shift the environment so profoundly that apologizing becomes the path of least resistance for them. When your calm, boundaries, consistency, self investment, neutrality, and withdrawal of privileges are all aligned, the narcissist encounters a reality where their usual strategies fail, their influence is blocked, and the loss of access to your attention, energy, or cooperation becomes unavoidable. In this scenario, the apology is no longer optional if they wish to regain what they have lost. Creating these conditions works because narcissists are driven by self interest, not empathy. They apologize when it serves a purpose, not because they suddenly understand or care about the pain they caused. By setting up circumstances where the cost of not apologizing outweighs their pride or ego, you make the apology a logical, almost automatic response. They begin to see that the previous dynamics where they could manipulate, provoke, or control you are gone. Every action you take reinforces this new reality, showing them that their behavior has real consequences. The clarity of your independence, consistency, and self respect removes the chaos and ambiguity they normally exploit, leaving the narcissist with a stark choice: acknowledge the breach and restore access, or continue losing influence and risk permanent disconnection. This strategy also leverages the psychological principle of scarcity. By limiting your supply, attention, validation, energy, or engagement, you create a void that the narcissist feels compelled to fill. The absence is not about punishment. It is about creating leverage through your own autonomy. They quickly learn that they cannot manipulate you as before, and that ignoring the situation only magnifies their loss. This combination of lost access, blocked control, and your consistent, calm presence produces internal pressure that drives them toward an apology. It is not a moment of moral reckoning, but a strategic calculation. They apologize because it is the fastest way to regain influence or restore a connection that is now conditional on respect and appropriate behavior. Ultimately, this eighth action is about engineering an environment rather than confronting a narcissist directly. When all the previous steps are applied together, calmness, removal of reactions, firm boundaries, self investment, withdrawal of privileges, consistency, and giving nothing to attack, they converge to create a scenario where apologizing is not just likely, it is practically unavoidable. The apology, in this sense, is a byproduct of your own empowerment and strategic detachment. You do not chase it, demand it, or plead for it. Instead, you shape reality so that it becomes the only viable option for the narcissist, turning the power dynamic completely in your favor while maintaining your integrity and control. In conclusion, dealing with a narcissist is not about arguing, begging, or trying to make them feel guilty. It's about reclaiming your power, setting clear boundaries, and shifting the dynamics so profoundly that they have no choice but to confront the consequences of their actions by going calm, removing your reactions, enforcing unwavering boundaries, investing in yourself, withdrawing privileges, staying consistent, giving them nothing to attack, and creating conditions wherein apology becomes necessary. You take control of the narrative and your own emotional space. The apology you seek is not a gift they give out of empathy or remorse. It is the logical result of a system you have engineered. When you operate from clarity, self-respect, and strategic detachment, you create an environment where their usual tactics fail, their influence wanes, and they are compelled to acknowledge their mistakes. The power lies not in forcing the apology, but in becoming the person they cannot manipulate, control, or ignore. And in doing so, you reclaim not just the apology, but your freedom, peace, and dignity.